The hall went silent when King Adrian Thorne raised his hand. Julian Vale had been standing beneath the royal dais for less than 3 minutes, but the weight of hundreds of watching eyes already felt heavier than the ceremonial silver at his collar. To his right stood his younger brother, Elias, dressed in royal blue. To his left, an empty place waited beside the throne. Adrian looked down at them both, composed as ever, then spoke with the calm certainty of a man accustomed to having his decisions become reality. The crown has made its choice. Elias Vale will stand beside me. Applause did not begin immediately. First came the silence, then the small intake of breath that traveled through the court like wind moving across tall grass. Julian felt every face turn toward him. Of course they did. For years, whenever the court discussed the future of the crown, his name had followed Adrian's as naturally as a second title. He had attended councils Adrian did not trust to anyone else. He had learned which reports the king wanted before Adrian asked for them, which ceremonies exhausted him, which diplomatic phrases meant compromise, and which meant war by another name. None of that had ever been called intimacy. It had been called preparation. Julian had allowed that word to stand. Now Adrian had chosen Elias. Publicly, Elias turned toward Julian first, not Adrian. His expression held no triumph, only shock and an uncertainty that made Julian realize his brother had expected the same outcome as everyone else. Julian could have hated him for one clean second. It would have been easier. Instead, he looked at Elias and saw someone who had always enjoyed the things Julian had endured. The formal receptions, the public attention, the ceremonial language, the expectation that a royal partner should know how to belong to a room before he belonged to himself. Elias had wanted this openly. Julian had simply become excellent at it. The applause finally started. Julian lifted his hands and joined it. That disturbed the room more than anger would have. Adrian's gaze found him immediately. Julian knew that look. The king used it when a negotiation moved in a direction he had not predicted. Julian bowed to Elias first, then to Adrian. "May the crown prosper under your majesty's choice." The words were proper. His voice did not break. Adrian's expression remained controlled, but his eyes narrowed slightly. He had expected disappointment, perhaps resentment, perhaps, later, a private conversation in which Julian would ask what more he needed to prove. Julian had expected that conversation too, right up until the moment Adrian said Elias's name. Then something inside him became strangely simple. He reached to the silver clasp at his collar. The small crown-shaped insignia had marked him as an official candidate for royal partnership for 3 years. Adrian himself had fastened the first one there after Julian's appointment. Julian removed it. A few people near the front stopped clapping. He placed the insignia on the velvet table reserved for ceremonial documents. Elias whispered, "Julian." Julian gave him the smallest shake of his head. "Not now. Not here." He turned toward the Lord Chamberlain. "I'll submit my formal relinquishment before the end of the day." The older beta stared at him. "My lord, there is no requirement for you to, I know." That was the point. Julian was not being dismissed from candidacy. Adrian had selected Elias, but Julian could have remained attached to the royal household, waiting in another role, preserving his proximity, preserving every possibility people assumed he still wanted. He could have let the court call him gracious, while quietly hoping Adrian regretted his decision. The thought exhausted him more than losing the crown did. Adrian descended one step from the dais. Julian. No title, just his name, delivered softly enough that the court pretended not to listen. Julian looked up. For years, one word in Adrian's voice had been enough to redirect his entire day. "Your Majesty." Something changed in Adrian's face. It was almost invisible, but Julian saw it because he had spent too long learning the man. "There's no need to make another decision today." Adrian's tone was measured, reasonable. It was the voice he used when someone else was allowing emotion to interfere with judgment. Julian understood what he believed was happening. Adrian thought Julian was hurt because he had lost the crown. He thought this was pride, a reaction, something that would pass once Julian remembered how much he had worked for the future Adrian had just given to Elias. Julian glanced once at the empty place beside the throne. Strangely, he felt no urge to reclaim it. What hurt was not seeing Elias there. What hurt was realizing Adrian had looked at years of Julian's presence and concluded that the thing holding him there was a crown. "I'm not making this decision because I'm angry," Julian said. Adrian studied him, searching for the emotion he expected to find. Then why make it? Julian almost answered. The truth rose close enough to frighten him, but he still did not have words he trusted. Not here. Perhaps not yet, even to himself. So he chose the one thing that was already clear. Because you made your choice. Adrian's jaw tightened. That does not mean there is no place for you here. There it was. A place. Julian had spent years becoming perfect for every place Adrian gave him. Advisor. Candidate. Reliable Omega. The person who remained after everyone else left. Adrian was already trying to move him into another square on the board. Julian bowed once more. Then I think it's time I decided where mine is. He walked from the hall before the ceremony officially ended. No one stopped him. Behind him, the applause never fully recovered. By sunset, Julian had signed the first document surrendering his candidacy and requested the remaining papers required to separate himself from the privileges and permanent access attached to it. The clerk read the request twice before accepting it. Across the palace, Adrian received notice before dinner. Julian knew he would. What Julian did not know was what Adrian would do when he realized this was not wounded pride, not a delay, and not an attempt to force reconsideration. For the first time in years, Julian had stopped waiting to be chosen. Now he had to discover what remained when he no longer organized his life around the possibility. By breakfast the next morning, the palace had already begun rearranging itself around Julian's absence. His name was gone from the preliminary schedule for the royal partnership briefings. 2 ceremonial fittings had been cancelled. A sealed packet from the Lord Chamberlain waited on the desk in his private rooms, containing the documents required to complete what he had started the night before. Julian stood over them for a long moment before breaking the seal. There were more pages than he expected. Relinquishing candidacy meant surrendering not only the possibility of standing beside Adrian as royal consort, but also the privileges attached to that path. Permanent access to the king's private working chambers, authority to review certain ceremonial correspondence, residence within the inner royal wing, and the automatic place Julian had held at Adrian's side during formal travel. He read every line. Then he signed the first page. By the 4th, his hand had stopped trembling. By the 7th, something inside him had gone strangely quiet. The last document concerned his access seal. Julian removed the silver token from his pocket and set it beside the papers. He had carried it for nearly 5 years. It opened doors most nobles waited their entire lives to enter. He had once believed that privilege meant he was getting closer to the future he wanted. Now it looked like a piece of metal. A knock sounded. Elias entered only after Julian called permission. His brother had changed out of the royal blue from the ceremony, but there was no escaping what had changed between them. A new insignia rested at Elias's collar. Julian noticed it. He also noticed, with some surprise, that the sight did not hurt as much as he had expected. Elias looked at the papers. You're really doing it. Julian signed another page. Yes. You don't have to give up everything connected to the palace. I know. Elias moved closer, unsettled by the same answer Julian had given the Chamberlain. Then why are you? Julian stopped writing. He could have told Elias that staying would be easier. He could remain one corridor away from Adrian, sit in meetings, receive private summons, continue being the person the king turned to without thinking. He could preserve the shape of his old life and call it professionalism. But if he did that, nothing important would actually change. He would still be waiting. Because I don't want to spend the next year standing beside a door that already closed, Julian said. Elias's expression tightened. I didn't ask him to choose me. I know. And I never wanted to take something from you. Julian looked at him then. Elias was frightened of being blamed for a competition Julian no longer wanted to enter. That realization removed the last easy place Julian might have put his anger. You didn't take it, he said. He chose. I'm choosing too. Elias searched his face, perhaps waiting for bitterness. When none came, he looked almost more worried. What will you do? Julian glanced down at the unfinished documents. For years, that question would have had an immediate answer. Attend Adrian's morning briefing. Review the diplomatic summaries. Prepare for whatever came next. Now the space beyond these signatures had no shape. I don't know yet. Saying it should have terrified him. Instead, it felt almost clean. Elias left without another argument. Julian finished signing. Before noon, the palace began taking him at his word. His access seal was deactivated. His standing invitation to the king's private council was withdrawn from the schedule. Servants arrived to inventory the ceremonial garments reserved for his candidacy, and Julian released them without protest. Each small administrative action removed another bridge back to the life he had known. None of them felt dramatic. That was what made them real. There would be no single door slamming behind him, just a series of doors that would no longer open when he approached. By early afternoon, Julian carried the completed packet himself to the Chamberlain's office. The older beta inspected the signatures with visible discomfort. Once this is filed, reinstatement would require a new royal nomination. Julian understood the warning. If Adrian changed his mind tomorrow, Julian could not simply step back into place. The court would have to acknowledge the reversal publicly. There would be questions, political embarrassment. Nothing about returning would be effortless. File it, Julian said. The Chamberlain hesitated, then pressed the royal seal into dark wax. The sound was soft. Final. Julian walked back through the inner corridor by habit and stopped when he reached the door leading toward Adrian's private wing. His hand moved toward the place where his access token had always rested. Empty pocket. For one absurd second, grief rose so quickly that he had to look away. This doorway had been part of his life for years. Adrian had summoned him through it at impossible hours, asked for his judgment when the palace slept, handed him papers without explanation because Julian always understood what mattered. Julian had once mistaken being constantly needed for being impossible to lose. He turned away before anyone could notice him standing there. Outside the inner wing, the palace sounded different. Louder, less controlled. People moved around him without stopping to ask what Adrian needed next. For the first time in years, Julian reached the middle of the day with nowhere he was required to be. The emptiness frightened him. Then, beneath the fear, came something he had not expected. Relief. Small, almost shameful, but real. No one was waiting for him to perform correctly. No one needed him to anticipate the king's mood. He did not have to wonder whether today would finally be the day Adrian looked at him and saw more than the position Julian had spent years perfecting. The crown was gone from his future. The pain of that remained. But so did the strange lightness of no longer chasing it. Across the palace, Adrian received confirmation of the filed relinquishment before Julian returned to his rooms. The king read the document twice. Then he asked one question. He surrendered the private access as well? The Chamberlain answered yes. Adrian was silent long enough for the older man to shift uneasily. By evening, however, Adrian had apparently decided Julian's withdrawal was a problem with a practical solution. A message arrived requesting Julian's presence the next morning. It did not ask him to reconsider the crown. Instead, it informed him that His Majesty wished to discuss another position, one carrying significant authority, status, and a permanent place within the king's working circle. Julian read the message once, then folded it carefully. Adrian still believed he understood what Julian wanted. Tomorrow, Julian would discover whether the king could understand him after being told no twice. The message from Adrian said 9 in the morning. Julian arrived at 9 exactly. For 5 years, he had entered the king's private working chambers without being announced. This time, the guard at the outer door checked his name against the appointment list before allowing him through. Julian felt the difference immediately. He had chosen it, but choice did not make every consequence painless. Adrian was standing beside his desk when Julian entered. Several documents had been arranged in a precise stack, the top page marked with the royal seal. Julian recognized the format before Adrian spoke. An appointment. Sit, Adrian said. Julian remained standing. I'm comfortable, Your Majesty. The title landed differently in the room than it had 2 days ago. Adrian noticed. His gaze held Julian's for a moment before moving to the papers. I've created a position that would make better use of your abilities than ceremonial partnership ever could. Julian said nothing. Adrian continued, confident now that he had reached practical ground. The position would carry senior authority over diplomatic preparation and royal correspondence. Julian would retain direct access to the king's working circle, attend strategic meetings, travel with the royal delegation when required, and hold rank above most court officials. It was, objectively, an extraordinary offer. More authority than Julian had possessed as a candidate. Less ceremony, more substantive work, almost perfectly designed for the person Adrian believed Julian to be. You wouldn't be answerable to Elias, Adrian added. Your authority would come directly from me. There it was again. Adrian had examined the loss and replaced every visible piece. Status, influence, access, proximity. He had even removed the possibility that Julian might resent serving beneath his younger brother. For one dangerous moment, Julian understood how easy accepting could be. Tomorrow morning, he could walk through these doors again without being stopped. He could sit across from Adrian, read the reports before anyone else, remain close enough to hear the slight change in the king's voice when he was tired. Nothing essential would have to feel lost. Except the reason Julian had walked away. Why did you choose Elias? He asked. Adrian had not expected the question. I told you. His temperament suits the public responsibilities of the position. That isn't what I asked. Adrian's expression tightened. Julian waited. Finally, Adrian moved away from the desk. Elias enjoys court life. He is comfortable being watched. He wants the ceremonial obligations that come with standing beside the crown. Every statement was true. Julian knew it before Adrian said it. And me? You've never cared about ceremony. No, you care about influence. Meaningful work. Being useful where decisions are actually made. Adrian gestured toward the appointment papers. This gives you more of that, not less. Julian stared at him. The answer was so reasonable that it hurt more than cruelty would have. Adrian had not chosen Elias because he valued Julian less. He had divided them according to function. Elias wanted the visible crown. Julian, Adrian believed, wanted the machinery behind it. Adrian had looked at years of Julian standing beside him and interpreted every sacrifice as ambition expressed in a more intelligent form. So you thought I would be satisfied, Julian said slowly. As long as I still had power. Adrian frowned. I thought you would prefer work suited to you. And remain here. Of course. The words came too quickly. Julian heard it. So did Adrian. A brief silence followed. Why of course? Julian asked. Adrian's jaw shifted. Because this is where your experience is most valuable. Valuable. Julian lowered his eyes to the appointment papers. 2 days ago, that word might have felt like praise. Now it touched the exact place that had been aching since the ceremony. You really did think I wanted the crown, he said. Adrian's patience thinned. You trained for it for years. Yes. You accepted every responsibility attached to candidacy. Yes. You built your entire adult life around the royal household. Yes. Adrian spread one hand toward the papers. Then help me understand what I am missing. Julian almost laughed, but there was nothing funny in it. Adrian finally knew there was something to understand. That was new. The problem was Julian still could not give him the complete answer. He had spent so long translating every personal desire into duty that even now the truth felt dangerous to name. But he knew enough to recognize the wrong answer. He pushed the appointment papers gently back across the desk. I don't want the position. Adrian did not touch them. Read the full terms before deciding. I have. You've read one page. I heard everything that mattered. Adrian's voice hardened. This is not charity, Julian. You earned this level of authority years ago. I know. Then why refuse it? Julian looked directly at him. Because it gives me exactly what I had before. Adrian glanced at the documents. It gives you considerably more authority than you had before. That's what you still don't understand. The room went still. Julian could see Adrian trying to fit this refusal into the same model that had explained everything else. Pride did not work anymore. Neither did wounded ambition. Adrian had offered more influence, more meaningful responsibility, more direct access. Julian was still saying no. I'm not punishing you, Julian said. And I'm not punishing Elias. I don't want you to reverse your decision. That finally unsettled Adrian. You don't? No, then what do you want? The question struck harder than Julian expected. No one had asked him that in years without already supplying the acceptable answer. He felt the truth again, close and terrifying, but not yet ready to become words. I'm trying to find that out, he said. Adrian studied him for a long time. And until you do? Julian glanced toward the door he once entered without permission. Until I do, stop finding new places for me. He bowed and left the appointment and signed. This time, when the guard opened the outer door, Julian did not look back. Behind him, Adrian remained with a prestigious position no ambitious man should have refused and a problem authority could not solve. For the first time, the king had evidence that Julian's choices were not about losing status, which left a question neither of them could avoid much longer. If Julian had never been staying for the crown, what had been keeping him beside Adrian all those years? For the next several days, the palace did exactly what Adrian had designed it to do. It adapted. Julian had expected his absence to create disorder, not catastrophe. He had never believed himself that important, but friction, missed details, delayed decisions, a stack of correspondence no one else knew how to prioritize. Instead, the machinery of the crown redistributed his work with almost insulting efficiency. 2 senior secretaries divided the diplomatic preparation he once handled alone. The master of ceremonies absorbed the public scheduling tied to Elias's new role. A younger advisor Julian had trained years earlier began attending the morning briefings Julian no longer entered. The doors kept opening. The meetings kept starting. The king kept ruling. Julian learned most of this indirectly because people still spoke to him as if he might return at any moment. They told him who had taken over which responsibilities, which office had inherited his files, how quickly Elias was adjusting to the formal obligations. No one seemed cruel about it. That almost made it harder. There was no dramatic collapse to prove Julian had been necessary. The world was simply continuing without him. On the 4th morning, Julian passed through the eastern gallery and saw Elias standing with the master of ceremonies beside a row of visiting dignitaries. His brother was nervous, but not miserable. He listened carefully, remembered names, smiled at the right moments, and seemed to grow more comfortable with every exchange. Julian stopped only long enough to watch Elias recover from a small mistake without anyone rescuing him. Then he moved on. Something in his chest loosened. Adrian had been right about one thing. Elias did suit this part of the role. Julian had always treated public ceremony like a test he could prepare for. Elias seemed to treat it like conversation. That recognition should have sharpened the humiliation. Instead, it made the decision feel less like theft. Elias had not taken Julian's future. Adrian had chosen a future Elias actually wanted. The more difficult question was why Julian had wanted it at all. Across the palace, Adrian was discovering a different kind of problem. The first week after Julian's withdrawal, every practical concern had an answer. A revised diplomatic brief arrived on time. The council notes were accurate. Elias's schedule stabilized. When a visiting delegation changed its arrival by half a day, 3 officials corrected the ceremonial plan without Julian ever being consulted. Adrian approved the adjustment and moved to the next item. The crown was functioning. That evening, however, he remained at his desk after the final secretary left. A report lay open before him, complete and professionally prepared. He read the same paragraph twice. The problem was not the report. It was that Julian would have marked one phrase in the margin, a sentence that sounded harmless but would irritate the Western envoy. Adrian knew this because Julian had been the one person who never needed the politics of a sentence explained to him. Adrian reached for a pen, corrected the phrase himself, and stopped. The work had been replaceable. The interruption in his thinking had not. The next morning, Adrian entered council and found the same younger advisor Julian had trained seated in Julian's former place. The man was competent. He answered every question clearly. By the end of the meeting, Adrian had no reasonable complaint. Still, when the council dismissed, he looked at the empty chair after everyone else had left. It irritated him enough that he ordered the room rearranged before the next session. Removing the chair did not help. Julian, meanwhile, had begun spending more time outside the inner royal wing. Without the candidacy schedule dictating every hour, he took on a limited set of administrative duties attached to his own family name. Work he could complete without remaining within Adrian's personal orbit. The tasks were smaller than the responsibilities he had surrendered. They were also his. No one expected him to anticipate the king before acting. No one praised him for making himself invisible inside someone else's needs. One afternoon, he finished early and discovered he had almost 3 hours with nothing scheduled. At first, he walked back toward the palace out of habit. Halfway across the courtyard, he stopped. There was no meeting waiting for him. No sealed packet from Adrian. No reason he had to be there. He turned in the opposite direction. The freedom felt awkward, almost wasteful. Then, slowly, it began to feel like time. Adrian saw him later that day from an upper corridor. Julian was crossing the lower courtyard with a folder tucked under one arm, speaking to an elderly clerk from his family's estate office. Nothing significant was happening. Julian was simply listening to the man explain something. then laughing when the clerk made a quiet remark. Adrian stopped walking. He could not remember the last time he had seen Julian laugh when there was no royal purpose attached to the moment. The realization produced no useful conclusion, only discomfort. That evening, Adrian asked his secretary whether Julian's former responsibilities had all been reassigned successfully. Yes, Your Majesty. Any gaps? The secretary considered. Nothing significant. Adrian looked down at the completed work on his desk. And Elias? Adapting well. He still needs guidance, but he appears to enjoy the public obligations. Adrian dismissed him. The answer should have settled something. It did the opposite. If the crown did not need Julian, then Adrian could no longer explain his attention as concern for the crown. And if Elias was not failing, there was no practical reason to reconsider the choice. Yet Adrian had become increasingly aware of Julian in every place Julian was not. The private working chamber was quieter. Meals lasted longer because no one interrupted Adrian's assumptions with the exact question he had overlooked. Even the walk between meetings felt different without Julian matching his pace 2 steps to the left, close enough to speak privately without appearing intimate. Adrian had once thought these things were habits created by work. Now the work remained and the habits had nowhere to go. Julian was confronting the same contradiction from the opposite side. The palace had not collapsed without him. Adrian had not summoned him back in desperation. Elias was not ruining the role. Every practical reason Julian might have used to explain his importance was disappearing. What remained was harder to measure. He sat alone that night with the old crown-shaped insignia no longer at his collar, thinking about the years he had spent preparing for a position he had walked away from in less than a day. If he had truly wanted the crown, losing it should have been the center of his grief. It was not. The thought had been circling him since the ceremony, but now there were fewer distractions left to hide behind. The role was gone. The work had been replaced. The palace was moving on. And Julian was beginning to understand that the question was no longer whether he had been necessary there. It was why he had been willing to stay so long in the first place. Julian did not sleep well that night. Not because he wanted the crown back. That was the problem. He had spent the evening waiting for grief to take a recognizable shape. Envy toward Elias, anger at Adrian, regret over the position he had surrendered. None of it came cleanly enough to explain him. The crown-shaped insignia lay on the table where he had placed it after the ceremony. Julian picked it up once, turned it between his fingers, then set it down again. It felt important because of everything he had attached to it. Without those meanings, it was only silver. The next morning, he returned to the family estate office and finished a set of correspondence before noon. The work demanded concentration, but not obedience. No one interrupted him with a royal request. No one expected him to know what Adrian would want before Adrian said it. When he completed the final document, the satisfaction was quiet and entirely his own. Then a palace messenger arrived. Julian almost laughed at the timing. The message was not a summons. Adrian was requesting a brief conversation. Requesting. Julian noticed the word. He went anyway. This time they met in a smaller working room outside the king's private chambers. No appointment papers waited on the table. No replacement title. Adrian stood by the window, one hand resting against the back of a chair, and for once he did not begin with a solution. The court has adjusted, he said. Julian waited. Elias is doing well. I know. Your former responsibilities have been reassigned. I know that too. Adrian looked at him. Does that bother you? Julian considered the question seriously. Less than I thought it would. Something shifted in Adrian's expression. Why? Julian could have answered with something safe. Because the staff were competent. Because Elias deserved the chance. Because institutions survived individuals. All true. None explained the ache that remained after those truths stopped hurting. I'm not sure it was ever the work I was afraid of losing, Julian said. Adrian went still. Julian regretted the words immediately, not because they were false, but because they had opened a door he had spent years keeping shut. Adrian did not rush through it. Then what were you afraid of losing? Julian looked toward the closed door leading farther into the royal wing. For years, he had walked through doors like that without thinking. He had called it access, responsibility, trust. He had given every intimate thing a professional name. Adrian asking for his judgment after midnight became duty. Adrian remembering Julian's preferred tea became routine. The way Julian could tell from one glance whether the king needed silence or argument became competence. If Julian named any of it differently, he would have had to admit how much of himself he had invested in a man who had never promised to choose him. I thought if I did everything right, Julian said slowly, eventually it would mean something. Adrian's brow tightened. It did mean something. To the crown. To me. The answer came too quickly to be calculated. Julian looked at him. Adrian seemed to hear his own words only after they were spoken. Silence settled between them. Julian could have taken that sentence and built another 5 years of hope around it. Once he would have. That realization hurt almost as much as the rejection. What did it mean, he asked. Adrian opened his mouth, then stopped. The king who could explain treaties, appointments, and succession in exact language had no immediate answer. Julian felt something inside him clarify. Not resolve. Not yet. But shape. Adrian had always known where Julian should stand. What work Julian should do. Which responsibilities suited him. He had known Julian's usefulness so completely that both of them had mistaken that knowledge for intimacy. And Julian had helped him do it. He had never said, I stay because I want to be near you. He had said, what else needs doing? He had never asked, do you see me differently from everyone else? He had made himself indispensable and waited for Adrian to translate service into affection. Maybe that had been unfair to both of them. But the ceremony had exposed the cost. Adrian had chosen Elias for the crown because Elias visibly wanted the public role. Julian had been offered something else because Adrian believed power, usefulness, and proximity would satisfy him. Adrian had not stolen Julian's dream. He had misunderstood it. Worse, Julian had spent years making that misunderstanding easy. I think I know why I stayed, Julian said. Adrian's attention sharpened. Julian almost stepped back from the truth. Instead, he forced himself to remain still. It wasn't the crown. Adrian said nothing. I told myself it was. Or at least I let everyone else believe it. It was easier that way. Julian looked down at his hands. Wanting a role is respectable. Wanting a future position makes sense. He stopped. The last word refused to come. Adrian did not supply it for him. That restraint mattered. Julian lifted his eyes again. I accepted everything that came with the crown because it kept me here. Near you. Adrian's face changed. Not dramatically, but enough that Julian knew the sentence had reached somewhere no court title ever had. Julian, don't. The word was soft. Adrian stopped immediately. Julian drew a breath. I'm not telling you this so you can fix it. That was the new thing. The truth did not feel like a request. I don't want Elias's place. I don't want another title. And I don't want you to choose differently because now you understand why it hurt. Adrian's voice was quieter when he answered. Then what do you want from me? Julian thought of the question from their last meeting. Back then he had not known. Now the answer was beginning to separate into two parts. What he had wanted before. What he needed now. They were no longer the same thing. Right now? Julian said. Nothing. Adrian flinched more visibly at that than he had at any accusation. Julian saw it and almost softened the answer. Habit urged him to make the moment easier for the king. He resisted. I spent years arranging myself around what I thought you might eventually decide. Julian continued. I need to know who I am when I stop doing that. Adrian looked toward the empty table between them, as if searching for something tangible to offer. There was nothing. For once, nothing was exactly what Julian needed. And if you find out? Adrian asked. Julian understood the question beneath the question. If you find out who you are without me, will there still be a place for me? He could not answer that honestly yet. Then I'll know what I'm choosing, Julian said. He left without anger. Adrian did not stop him. Outside, the palace looked exactly as it had the week before, but the conflict had changed completely. Julian no longer needed to understand why he had surrendered the crown. He understood. He had never wanted the throne beside Adrian as much as he had wanted Adrian to choose him personally. Now that truth was finally visible to both of them, the harder question belonged to the king. If Julian's work was replaceable and the crown had never been the real bond between them, what exactly had Adrian been holding on to all these years? The morning after Julian told Adrian the truth, he did something he had never done before. He made a decision without first asking how it would affect the king. The family estate office had offered him a larger permanent role managing its diplomatic correspondence and external affairs, work Julian had already begun helping with since leaving royal candidacy. A week earlier, he would have treated it as temporary, something to occupy the Hours until the palace found the proper place for him again. Now he read the appointment terms differently. The work belonged to House Vale, not the crown. His schedule would be his own. His judgment would matter because of the decisions he made, not because he had learned to predict Adrian's preferences. Accepting meant committing enough of his future that returning to his old routine would no longer be effortless. Julian signed. When Elias found out, he stared at the document and then at his brother. "You're staying with the estate office?" "Yes. Permanently." Julian looked at the word beside his signature. "That's what I agreed to." Elias smiled cautiously. "You sound surprised." "I am." The admission made them both laugh, and Julian realized how rare it had become for choices about his future to feel ordinary enough to laugh about. Over the next several days, the difference became practical. Julian stopped keeping the palace schedule in his head. He began attending meetings that had nothing to do with Adrian's counsel. He reviewed correspondence addressed to House Vale and made decisions without wondering whether the king would approve. Some were small. Some affected long-standing arrangements between noble estates. None required Julian to perform as a potential royal partner. The work did not transform him overnight. He still woke some mornings expecting a sealed palace packet. His hand still went instinctively toward the pocket where his access token had once rested. But each time the old habit failed, something new took its place. A responsibility he had chosen. A conversation he did not need to report upward. An afternoon whose value did not depend on whether Adrian noticed how well Julian had used it. The cost was equally real. His presence at the palace became less frequent. Formal invitations still arrived when his family required representation, but the private rhythm between Julian and Adrian disappeared almost entirely. No late-night reports. No silent walks between council chambers. No reason for Julian to stand beside Adrian simply because he always had. Adrian could have changed that. Julian knew it. A royal request would have been difficult to ignore. A direct appointment could have pulled him back into crown business before his new position settled around him. But no order came. Instead, Adrian did something Julian noticed precisely because it was so unlike the man he had known. He asked. The first request arrived 3 days after Julian signed his new appointment. A diplomatic document from one of House Vale's neighboring estates overlapped with a royal negotiation Julian had previously advised on. Adrian's secretary sent a note asking whether Julian was willing to offer his assessment, not instructing him to attend, not assuming he would, asking. Julian read the note twice before agreeing. He sent his analysis in writing rather than returning to the palace. Adrian accepted it without requesting more. The boundary remained intact. That mattered more than Julian wanted to admit. A second request came several days later. This time Adrian asked whether Julian would attend a short joint meeting because House Vale's interests were directly involved. Julian checked his own schedule before answering. In the past, he would have moved anything necessary. Now he replied that the proposed time did not work and offered another. The palace accepted the change. The world did not end. Neither did the relationship. When Julian finally entered the meeting room, Adrian was already there. Their eyes met for a moment. Adrian did not comment on the rescheduled hour. He simply thanked Julian for coming. The meeting itself remained professional, and that was almost more difficult than open tension would have been. Adrian listened when Julian spoke. Julian disagreed with him once and did not soften the disagreement to preserve harmony. Adrian considered the point, changed one part of the proposal, and moved on. No reward. No private acknowledgement. No attempt to turn cooperation into restored intimacy. When the work was finished, Julian gathered his papers. Adrian remained seated. Your new position suits you, he said. Julian paused. Weeks ago, the statement would have sounded like another attempt to place him correctly. Now Adrian's tone held something different. Observation rather than assignment. I think it might. Julian said. Adrian nodded. Nothing more. Julian left first. The restraint unsettled him in a way Adrian's earlier pursuit had not. It would have been easier to reject another prestigious offer. Easier to defend himself against command. Respect was harder because it allowed hope to return without demanding it. Adrian, meanwhile, was learning the cost of giving Julian the freedom he claimed to want for him. The crown continued functioning. The advisors Julian had trained performed well. Elias grew more confident beside the throne. There was no practical crisis requiring Julian's return. And Julian's new life was beginning to work. Adrian could see it in small things. Julian no longer arrived at every palace engagement already anticipating the king's needs. He spoke to other people before looking for Adrian. Once, after a formal meeting, Julian declined an invitation to remain for dinner because he already had plans connected to his new responsibilities. Adrian almost told him to stay. Almost. Then he remembered the conversation in the smaller working room. I need to know who I am when I stop arranging myself around what you might decide. Adrian let him leave. That choice cost more than any order would have. For the first time, he was not testing whether Julian would remain loyal. He was watching Julian become capable of staying gone. And the more complete Julian's independent life became, the less Adrian could pretend his own discomfort belonged to the crown. Julian's work had replacements. His old ceremonial future had passed to Elias. The kingdom was stable. Yet Adrian still noticed every room Julian entered and every room he left. By the end of the month, Julian had commitments the king could not casually rearrange, work that did not depend on royal favor, and the beginnings of an identity that no longer pointed automatically toward the throne. Adrian had respected every step. That was the first real evidence that he might finally understand what Julian had asked for. It also created a problem neither of them could avoid forever. If Adrian could no longer justify wanting Julian nearby because the crown needed him, and if Julian was becoming genuinely capable of building a life without Adrian, then any future between them would have to be chosen without duty, status, or necessity to hide behind. By the time the court formally revised the royal household structure, Julian had already built enough of a life outside it that the news should not have mattered. That was what he told himself, at least. The revised arrangement was practical. Elias would continue in the public royal role Adrian had chosen for him. The offices Julian had once handled had been redistributed permanently. House Vale's work now occupied most of Julian's days, and no one at the palace was waiting for him to return. Then a sealed notice arrived requesting his presence for a final appointment discussion. Not a command, not even a summons. A request. Julian almost declined. He had already refused one position. Adrian had already respected the life Julian was building. Another conversation about titles felt dangerously close to repeating an old argument. But the wording was different this time. The proposed position was not designed to replace Elias. It was a legitimate senior role created by the new structure of the crown, one that matched Julian's experience and would restore him to regular royal work without changing the public choice Adrian had made. Julian understood immediately why it was more dangerous than the first offer. The first had been easy to reject because Adrian had clearly been trying to solve humiliation with prestige. This one made sense. It was good work. It carried real authority. It would not place Julian beneath Elias. It would not require him to pretend the original selection had never happened. And it would put him back within Adrian's daily orbit. For the first time since walking away, Julian wanted to say yes. That frightened him more than wanting to say no ever had. He entered the same smaller working room where he had once admitted the crown was never what he truly wanted. Adrian was alone. A single document rested on the table. No presentation. No ceremonial language. Adrian did not slide it toward him immediately. You know what this is? I read the summary. Then you also know it wasn't created for you. Julian nodded. That mattered. The role existed because the palace structure had changed, not because Adrian had invented another excuse to keep him close. Adrian continued. You're qualified. More than qualified. Julian almost smiled. That sounds familiar. Adrian accepted the criticism without defending himself. It should. He looked down at the document. The difference is that I'm not asking you to take it because I believe I know where you belong. Julian said nothing. I'm asking whether you want it. The words should have made the choice simpler. Instead, they removed the easiest reason to refuse. Julian stepped closer to the table and read the appointment terms carefully. They were fair. Better than fair. The authority was substantial. The responsibilities interested him. The work itself did not recreate the old candidacy. But beneath all of that lay the truth neither of them could ignore. Taking it would return him to Adrian's world every day. It would restore proximity without requiring either man to decide what that proximity meant. Julian could accept the title, return to the palace, and let their unfinished relationship disappear beneath useful work again. He could have Adrian near without ever risking a direct answer. For years, that would have felt like victory. Now it felt like retreat. If I accept this, Julian said, What happens between us? Adrian's gaze lifted. Professionally? No. The silence that followed held more weight than the document. Adrian did not pretend to misunderstand. I don't know. Julian looked back at the page. Neither do I. That shouldn't determine whether you take work you want. It does if the work gives us an excuse not to answer anything else. Adrian's expression changed. Not anger. Recognition. Julian moved away from the table. I could come back here every day. We could work together exactly the way we used to. You could tell yourself you respected my choice because I accepted freely. I could tell myself I built an independent life because no one ordered me back. He paused. And 6 months from now, I might realize I rebuilt the same cage with a better title. Adrian did not argue. That made the decision harder. Do you want the position? He asked. Julian answered honestly. Part of me does. Adrian's hands tightened once at his sides, then relaxed. And the rest? Julian looked at him. The rest of me knows why. There it was. The final test of everything he had learned since the ceremony. Could he distinguish meaningful work from the old longing attached to proximity? Could he want something and still refuse it because the reason mattered? Adrian turned slightly toward the window. If you say no, I'll appoint someone else. Julian knew what that meant. The opportunity would not wait. The palace would reorganize again. The last natural path back into Adrian's daily life would close. I know, and I won't hold it open. I know. Adrian looked at him then, and for the first time Julian saw something almost like fear beneath the king's control. Not fear of losing an advisor. Fear that respecting Julian's freedom might actually cost him Julian. Julian felt the old instinct rise immediately. Make it easier for him. Accept something. Stay available. Prove the relationship still had a future by refusing to leave completely. He let the instinct pass. I'm declining, Julian said. The words landed softly. Adrian closed his eyes for half a second, then nodded. All right. No persuasion. No reminder of duty. No better offer. No command. Julian felt the consequence settle between them. The old route was gone. He had chosen that. Adrian picked up the appointment document, folded it once, and set it aside. I'll name another candidate tomorrow. Final. Julian should have felt relieved. Instead, grief moved through him. Cleaner now, because there was nothing left to confuse it with. He was not losing a title. He was losing the last structure that could have kept Adrian in his life without requiring either of them to be brave. Adrian seemed to understand the same thing. Julian. He stopped at the door. Yes. Adrian looked at the discarded appointment rather than at him. When you told me the crown was never what kept you here, I spent a long time trying to decide what that meant about you. Julian waited. Adrian finally met his eyes. I think I was asking the wrong question. What question should you have been asking? Adrian was silent for a moment. Why I still wanted you here after I no longer needed anything from you. Julian's breath caught, but Adrian did not move closer. He did not answer his own question. Not yet. Julian understood why. Anything said now could still be mistaken for another attempt to stop him from walking away. So Julian opened the door. Then answer it before you come looking for me again. Adrian gave a single nod. Julian left. Behind him remained the crown, the palace, and the last respectable excuse either man had for staying close without naming what they wanted. Ahead of him was a life he had chosen and a king who could no longer offer him a role in place of an answer. If Adrian came to him again, there would be no title left between them, no duty to hide behind, and no guarantee Julian would still say yes. Adrian did not come looking for Julian the next day, or the day after that. Julian noticed both absences. He hated that he noticed them, but he did not change his schedule because of them. He went to the estate office each morning, handled the correspondence waiting on his desk, met with people who needed decisions from House Vale rather than favors from the crown, and left when the work was done. No messenger appeared at his door. No royal seal interrupted his afternoon. For once, Adrian seemed to be doing exactly what Julian had asked, answering the question before coming back. On the fourth evening, Julian returned to his rooms and found Adrian waiting in the receiving room. Alone. No guards inside. No secretary. No papers. No appointment document. Julian stopped in the doorway. Adrian stood when he entered, but did not move toward him. That restraint told Julian more than any title could have. You said not to come until I had an answer, Adrian said. Do you? Yes. Julian set the folder he was carrying on a side table. His pulse had already started to climb, but he refused to let anticipation make the decision for him. Then say it. Adrian drew a slow breath. I thought I wanted you near me because you were useful. Julian stayed silent. Then your work was reassigned. The palace. Continued. Elias adapted. Every practical reason I had for needing you disappeared. Adrian looked directly at him. You didn't. The words were simple enough that Julian almost mistrusted them. Adrian continued before Julian could respond. I still looked for you in rooms where you no longer belonged. I still wanted your judgment when I already had competent advisors. I still noticed when you left before dinner, even when there was no reason for you to stay. His voice lowered. I kept calling that habit because habit was something I could manage. Julian remembered the empty chair Adrian had removed from council. The requests rather than commands. The role Adrian had allowed him to refuse. Evidence, not promises. And now? Julian asked. Now I know I was lying to myself. Adrian did not soften the statement. You weren't important because you were useful to the crown. You were useful to the crown because you were important to me, and I used the first truth to avoid admitting the second. Julian felt the answer land exactly where years of uncertainty had lived. Once, it would have been enough. More than enough. He would have taken those words and returned to the palace before Adrian finished speaking. That was why he did not move. Adrian seemed to understand. I'm not offering you Elias's place. Good. I'm not asking you to leave the work you chose. Julian's shoulders loosened slightly. And I'm not asking you to become available whenever I decide I need you. Adrian paused. I'm asking whether there is still a possibility of something between us that isn't a position. There it was. No crown. No office. No duty. Just a question Adrian could not answer himself. Julian had wanted this moment for years. Now that it existed, his first reaction was not joy. It was fear. If he said yes, what proved he was not simply falling back into the old hunger to be chosen? What proved Adrian's choice would not quietly become another role Julian learned to perform perfectly? Adrian read something in his expression. You can say no. Julian's eyes lifted. Adrian did not look away. I mean that, he said. If no is the answer, I will respect it. I won't create another reason for you to come back. I won't use the crown to make your life smaller until I fit inside it. Julian heard the cost in that promise. Adrian was not merely offering vulnerability. He was surrendering the one advantage he had always relied on, the ability to structure the world around his decisions. The Alpha King could still command a court. He could not command this answer. Julian crossed the room slowly and stopped several feet away. If I say yes, I'm not coming back to the way things were. I know. My work stays mine. Yes. If the palace needs me professionally, it asks. It doesn't assume. Adrian nodded. Yes. And if you want me personally, you ask that too. Adrian's expression changed then, something quiet breaking through the control. I can do that. Julian shook his head. Don't say it because you want the answer tonight. Say it because you understand what happens when you don't. Adrian held his gaze. Then I understand. Silence settled between them. Not the old silence, where Julian waited for Adrian to define the next step. This one belonged to him. He could leave. Adrian had made that possible. Julian looked at the man he had once organized his entire future around and asked himself the question that mattered now. Not, has he finally chosen me? Not, did I win? But, if there were no crown, no promised role, no reward for staying, would I still choose him? The answer came without the old desperation attached to it. Yes, Julian said. Adrian exhaled, but he did not reach for him immediately. Even relief waited for permission now. Julian noticed that too. Yes, he repeated more steadily. But I'm choosing you. Not the palace. Not the place beside the throne. You. Adrian's eyes closed for one brief moment. When he opened them, the king looked less powerful and more honest than Julian had ever seen him. Then I choose you the same way. This time Julian stepped forward first. He closed the distance Adrian had refused to take for him. The gesture was small, but it changed everything. Adrian did not claim him. Julian did not surrender. They simply stood close enough that neither role could explain the moment. The crown had once decided where. Julian waited, what he worked toward, and how he measured his worth. Now it had no part in the choice at all. Adrian had finally chosen Julian without offering him a throne, and Julian had finally said yes without needing one. The old question was finished. What remained was whether they could live that truth when the palace, the court, and every habit that had shaped them were still waiting outside the door. The first test of their new relationship came the next morning, and it was almost embarrassingly ordinary. Adrian sent a note to Julian's office asking whether he would join him for dinner that evening. Not summoning him. Not informing him that a place had been prepared. Asking. Julian read the message between two pieces of House Vale correspondence and checked the appointments already written into his schedule. He had promised to review a set of estate agreements late that afternoon. Once, he would have moved them without hesitation. Instead, he sent back a reply saying he could come an hour later than Adrian proposed. The answer returned less than 10 minutes later. That works. Julian stared at those two words longer than necessary. Nothing dramatic had happened. No one had sacrificed a throne. Yet something fundamental had. Adrian had asked. Julian had answered. The world had adjusted around both choices. That evening, Julian arrived at the palace after finishing his work. His old access seal had never been restored. At the inner wing, the guard checked his name before opening the door. Julian felt the old ache for only a moment. Then he realized Adrian had not quietly returned the privilege as a romantic gesture. The consequence of Julian's withdrawal remained real. He was not being folded back into his previous life. Adrian was waiting in a private dining room rather than the working chamber where so much of their relationship had once hidden behind documents. When Julian entered, Adrian rose. You finished what you needed to? Yes. Good. Adrian did not ask why Julian had not come earlier. He did not make a joke about being outranked by estate correspondence. He simply accepted that Julian had a life whose schedule did not begin with the king. Dinner was not effortless. Years of habit did not disappear because they had finally spoken honestly. Twice Adrian started to ask Julian's opinion about crown business and stopped himself. The second time Julian noticed. You can ask me things, he said. Adrian looked almost defensive. You said the palace should ask professionally rather than assume. I did. This isn't a professional meeting. Julian smiled. Then maybe ask me something that isn't work. Adrian was silent for a moment, visibly less comfortable than he had ever been in council. Did you enjoy your day? The simplicity of it caught Julian off guard. No one had ever asked him that as if the answer mattered independently of productivity. Actually, Julian said, yes. Adrian listened while Julian told him about a difficult agreement he had finally untangled at the estate office. He did not redirect the conversation toward how the solution might benefit the crown. He did not turn Julian's competence into another reason he should return. He simply listened. Julian felt something inside him loosen. Not because Adrian had finally learned the perfect thing to say, but because he had stopped making Julian's value prove itself through usefulness. In the weeks that followed, the differences remained small enough to be tested. Adrian asked before requesting Julian's presence at formal events. Julian sometimes accepted. Sometimes he did not. The first time he declined because of another commitment, a familiar anxiety followed the answer. Somewhere inside him, the old wound still expected affection to disappear the moment he stopped being convenient. Adrian's response arrived shortly afterward. Understood. Another evening? That was all. No punishment. No distance. No colder tone the next time they met. Julian read the message and recognized the feeling that replaced his fear. Safety. Elias noticed the change before the court did. One afternoon, he found Julian preparing to leave the palace after a brief family meeting. You're not staying for the royal reception? Elias asked. Julian shook his head. You're better at those. Elias laughed. Finally admitting it? I think I admitted it the day Adrian chose you. For the first time, the memory did not tighten the room around them. Elias adjusted the royal insignia at his collar. He had grown comfortable wearing it. It suited him in a way Julian could now appreciate without comparison. Are you happy? Elias asked. Julian considered the question. Once, happiness had meant reaching the place everyone assumed he wanted. Now it felt quieter. I'm getting there. Elias nodded toward the corridor where Adrian was expected to appear later. And him? Julian smiled slightly. He's learning to ask. The final proof came at another public ceremony in the same great hall where everything had broken open. Julian almost laughed when he entered and saw the royal dais, the rows of nobles, the polished ceremonial table. Elias stood beside Adrian in the public role he had been chosen to fill. Julian stood with House Vale rather than beside the throne. No one had changed that arrangement to manufacture a romantic correction. The crown had not been returned to him. His candidacy remained relinquished. His old privileges remained gone, and for the first time, none of that felt like evidence of loss. During a pause between formal proceedings, Adrian's gaze found Julian across the hall. Months earlier, that look would have been enough to make Julian search for some unspoken task. A document forgotten. A person needing introduction. A problem the king expected him to solve. Adrian did not signal. He waited. When the ceremony ended, nobles began moving toward the reception hall. Adrian remained near the dais while Elias was drawn into conversation with several guests. Julian could have left with his family. Instead, he crossed the room because he wanted to. Adrian watched him approach, but did not step down to claim the decision for him. "Are you staying?" he asked when Julian reached him. Once, Adrian would have assumed. Once, Julian would have answered before checking himself. Now Julian looked around the hall, at Elias laughing comfortably beneath the royal banners, at the ceremonial table where the crown rested under the lights, and finally back at Adrian. "For a while," he said. Adrian smiled. "I'd like that." They walked toward the reception together, not because protocol placed Julian there, and not because the crown required him beside the king. The crown-shaped insignia Julian had surrendered was still locked away among the things he no longer needed. The throne remained Adrian's. Elias's public role remained Elias's. Julian's work remained his own. Nothing had been reset to create a happy ending. Instead, the meaning had changed. The first time Julian stood in that hall, everyone had waited for the Alpha King to decide his future. Now Adrian waited for Julian's answer, and Julian knew he could give it freely. The quiet between them no longer felt like obedience or distance. It felt comfortable. At the doors, Adrian slowed and glanced at him, waiting again. Julian understood the question without needing it spoken. This time, he did not disappear into silence. He reached for Adrian's hand because he chose to. Behind them, the crown remained on its table, exactly where it belonged.